If you've looked around on Twitter lately, you may have seen people talking about a mod which seems to be changing the game dramatically. Zoe first showed it to the public in a video where she completes a level that is seemingly impossible in terms of FPS. Then, numerous people came out showing some really good progress on hard levels on 60 FPS. Many people have said this raises the skill ceiling immensely, and others have been asking when they could get to try it. So firstly, it's important to say that this mod is out right now. But what does it actually do? How are players managing to get insane progress on 60 FPS? And what if I told you that by using this mod, you could have an input precision equal to 1000 or even 8000 FPS? The game processes visuals, physics, and most importantly inputs at a mostly consistent rate. Most people playing normally will play on 60 FPS, so these things will be updated 60 times a second. In the game's history, people have always wanted to have better input precision. This is the amount of time it takes for your input to actually be registered in-game. Players were having issues with not enough precision, because no matter where you click in a frame, you will always have to wait until the next frame for it to be registered. This hindered how precise players could be, making the game much harder. Historically, the method used to achieve better input precision was simply to increase your FPS. Doing this will make the game process everything at a higher rate, and as such, your inputs will happen sooner. For example, Riot used 144 FPS when verifying Bloodbath, which was the first time that high FPS was shown to make players better.
Oh my god!
To avoid having to afford extremely expensive monitors just to get an advantage, modders invented the FPS bypass, which allowed users to play at a higher FPS regardless of their monitor. It was highly controversial at first, but due to the distinct advantage people could get from affording better monitors, and to make the playing field even, it was allowed. Players eventually went up to the current standard of 360 FPS, which is 6 times faster than the original 60 FPS, and helped players push the skill ceiling way further than what was possible before. Eventually though, players reached a huge problem with increasing FPS further: lag. While 360 FPS allows for inputs to be registered 6 times faster, you also have to process visuals and physics 6 times more. This is obviously way more intensive than before, and many computers struggle to run it for highly decorated levels. Although workarounds such as better hardware over time and low detail modes existed, a lot of people still couldn't afford the hardware required to achieve the same benefits that other players could. As such, the maximum FPS for 2.1 was kept at 360, which served as a good middle ground between good precision and not requiring extreme hardware. For years, this maximum was what every top player used. Every major accomplishment you know of was almost certainly done on this FPS. Even if some players may have wished for a higher cap to push the skill ceiling even more, it would compromise the fairness for people who couldn't afford good enough hardware. One mod which released a couple years ago attempted to solve the problems with lag. Although it was effective for some people, it couldn't quite do enough to be a concrete solution. This mod was Draw Divide, more commonly known as TPS bypass. Looking back at FPS bypass, we can see that it increases all processes at the same time, causing more and more lag as your FPS increases. TPS bypass attempted to solve this by only increasing the physics and input calculations on their own, leaving the visual part to be set to any other value. This allowed players to play on a lower FPS such as 60 visually, but still receive the benefits of a higher FPS. This mod was a huge breakthrough, but multiple problems were still too oppressive for the FPS cap to be increased. Firstly, despite reducing lag quite a bit, it was still a big problem for a lot of people. If the cap was increased, the problems with lag would become way worse than before. Secondly, the mod gave no benefits for people who already played at a high FPS. As such, no top player really felt the need to ever use it or considered using it beyond 360 FPS. And lastly, players would still vastly prefer to play at a higher FPS visually if possible. The difference between 60 and 360 FPS in terms of motion clarity and stuttering is extremely apparent. This isn't able to be shown just through a YouTube video, but there are other videos showing how much of a difference it makes. If these problems were not enough, players would eventually be hit with a bombshell, which was 2.2. The massive update was obviously a huge benefit for the community, which has been thriving thanks to the new editor tools and other additions. But one thing stood out like an absolute bombshell which players have still been debating about to this day. The rate limit for physics and inputs in 2.2 was 240 FPS. Now, this understandably does not seem that consequential at first. After all, it's only a third less than 360 FPS itself, but as top players updated the game, it became clear very quickly that this was a massive problem. They had gotten very used to the precision that 360 FPS gave, and combined with other things such as the physics changes, people were so disappointed that they didn't even want to play on 2.2 at all. 240 FPS was simply not enough anymore. Absolute, the creator of the most popular mod menu Mega Hack, eventually made a mod called Physics Bypass, which allowed players to bypass the 240 FPS limit. This would have been fine, but changing the physics of the game when RobTop specifically wanted to preserve consistency across players was a dangerously controversial thing to do. Rob never explicitly disallowed FPS bypass from existing at all in 2.1, but this would be going against his developmental decisions. And regardless, even when players tried 360 FPS with physics bypass, they still felt like 2.1 just felt better to play overall. With all of these problems, it eventually felt like there was simply no solution when it comes to FPS. People had tried in the past, but now the community is more disconnected than ever when it comes to what is needed, what is allowed, and what should be done. But this new mod from Sizey is different. It forgoes the current FPS limit, but due to it being almost lag-free, everyone would be able to use it regardless of hardware. It gives players everything they wanted and more, while also being available to almost everyone. This is the Click Between Frames mod, and here's how it works. It is important to note that the game actually performs multiple calculations in every single frame depending on your FPS, known as steps. We'll use 60 FPS for this example. There are 4 steps on every frame for 60 FPS, and these steps can be visualized as 4 ones to symbolize each being one step. A normal frame should always have these steps add up to 4 when using 60 FPS. Although inputs can never take place within the steps normally, even with things like FPS and TPS bypass, steps are used for things such as physics calculations. As said before, FPS bypass raises the rate of visuals, physics, and inputs. TPS bypass attempts to fix the lag by updating the physics and inputs at a higher rate separately, but isn't quite sufficient. Sizey's mod takes a completely different approach, which also doesn't require any bypassing at all. The mod completely rewrites the input tracking and separates it from both visuals and physics. This rewritten input system does not run at a fixed rate at all, and instead simply waits until the player has clicked. The visuals and physics run separately, so you'll still be running the game completely fine. When the player clicks, that action is detected instantly by the input function. Instead of waiting until the next frame to register the input, the mod looks at the steps in the current frame and modifies them depending on when the player clicked. Let's say the player clicked halfway into the 3rd step. The mod will then split this step into 2 half steps and have the input take place between them. Although this makes it so there are 5 steps in the frame, because 2 of those steps are only half as long as a normal step, the total duration of the frame is the same as if there were 4 steps. The mod will dynamically determine how to split the steps depending on when you clicked. This allows for the player to have extreme precision and, by the mod's title, allow you to click between frames. And the best part of all of this is that the mod does not add much lag at all, especially compared to how much lag FPS bypass gives. Players can freely use this at 60 FPS and receive immense benefits. This still leaves some obvious questions, which I'll go over now. As said before, the mod doesn't rely on a consistent rate for tracking inputs, it just detects them instantly. In simple terms, when splitting the steps in a frame, the FPS dynamically changes depending on when you clicked. For 2.2, changing FPS while using the mod will simply change the rate of visuals and won't affect inputs at all. This does create some very interesting quirks however. Certain levels, such as the one Zoe showed on Twitter, would normally be physically impossible without the mod, but now are possible. Due to the way the mod tracks inputs and how it uses them, the mod is unbelievably precise. I've tested it myself in the wave game mode, and at times the difference between almost identical inputs can be seen by mere pixels at 10 times zoom. It's so precise in fact that the precision of inputs would no longer be limited by your FPS, but rather the polling rate of the device you use. Typically, most good mice and keyboards have an input polling rate of 1000 Hz. This means that with the mod, you would basically have your inputs be tracked at a rate of 1000 FPS. It becomes even more absurd if you have bought a device capable of 8000 Hz polling, as you are now able to have the equivalent of 8000 FPS input precision. However, if you don't know what your input polling is, it's most likely 1000 Hz, and the difference between 1000 and 8000 Hz isn't actually that significant. The main question people will have now that the mod is released is whether or not it counts as cheating, to which I say yes and no. It is very reasonable to just say that this gives way too much of an advantage compared to vanilla and should not be allowed due to that. But it's also reasonable to say that this mod brings together the community and allows almost everyone to have a fair advantage regardless of their hardware. The mod also doesn't feature any discrepancies in physics, which was what made the physics bypass so controversial in the first place. Overall, the community should aim to try and get this implemented in vanilla by RobTop himself, not through harassment or immense pressure. But this is something that would objectively improve the game for everyone and should absolutely be implemented without the need for mods. From my own experience with it, my enjoyment of the game has genuinely gone up, and it's clear from other top players that this revolutionises the playing field. And personally, I think almost everyone will agree that it provides a way more responsive experience than ever before, and that this should be added to vanilla. So what now? Wait to see how it goes. Also, please go and donate to the creator of the mod, Sizey, if you can. This guy has single-handedly changed the game forever, and will use this mod for his last college assignment. Also, he needs a new monitor. So go donate to him. Now.